In this fourth and final module, we're just going to take a short taster of Darwin Biography, looking in particular at two different works. The first is Darwin's own memoir that was penned shortly before his death and then edited successively by his son Francis and then his granddaughter Nora Barlow. And it's really the first biographical representation we have of the great man himself. The other one that I want to pay some attention to in this particular module is the biography by Desmond and Moore, which was published in 1992. And in many regards, while it was highly acclaimed when it was released, it has become more and more controversial as the years go by. Now, a lot of what we'll be doing in this particular subject is looking at different biographical representations of the great man, trying to figure out which one we think fits best with the Darwin of historical record. Towards the end of his life, Darwin sat down and started thinking about all that he'd been through. His mind turned to writing a memoir. He'd been approached by a German publisher who wanted to publish his recollections, but Darwin on the whole seems to have been quite reticent about making public things that best remained private. Still, he sat down and wrote his memoirs. But they were not to see the light of day until 5 years after his death. Over the next 150 years after his death in 1882, Darwin would have many people who would protect his legacy and become the gatekeeper to his memory. The first of these was his son Francis. To him fell the duty of editing the memoir. At first, it must have seemed quite a simple job, but soon family politics came into play. There were in particular concerns about some of the more atheistical or perhaps agnostic statements that Darwin made in his memoir. It was suggested in no uncertain terms to Francis that he should leave these statements out to prevent any controversy. And so it happened. The second major guardian of the great man's memory was Nora Barlow, his granddaughter. A scientist by training, she had studied under William Bateson, a prominent Darwinian of his own age. She had the family privilege of being able to examine Darwin's original manuscript, and she was somewhat surprised, we may even say taken aback, by what she found. Not only the omissions on account of Darwin's religious views, but also some quite scurrilous, or at least fairly rude remarks about some of his contemporaries, in particular Richard Owen and Herbert Spencer. Barlow reinstated many of these omissions. The world had moved on. People were not so concerned about the orthodoxies of religion. Owen and Spencer were long dead. Only their memory could be offended by the things that Darwin had said. We might say that Barlow had somehow restored something of Darwin's humanity to him. At the very least, it was good to know how much he had been annoyed by Spencer. At the very least, Darwin's memoir demonstrates to us how unreliable memoirs can be. But we have to remember as well, for the best part of 60 or 70 years, this was the closest that anyone got to Darwin. This was the best way that people had of figuring out what kind of a man he was. However, after the Second World War, his papers increasingly became public, and people started using them to research new biographies. And a very similar trajectory occurred to the one that I mapped out in the last module. a trajectory where the new social history started impacting upon the way that people wrote biography, that the new history of science and the methods that underwrote that started infecting, it's not a very nice word, but I think we'll run with it, started infecting the way that people wrote biographies of Darwin. And I'm going to turn to perhaps the most controversial of the Darwin biographies now, just to have a brief look at how the new methods created a new Charles Darwin. Behold, Adrian Desmond, arms crossed, and James Moore, the two authors of the biography Darwin that came out to much acclaim in 1992. It is an extraordinarily readable work of history. The depth of research appears to pour off every single page. The pace is unrelenting, muscular. It's biographical writing on steroids, which makes one suspect that the principal writer, rather than researcher, was Adrian Desmond, who has real form of writing this kind of work. In many regards, I would say if you were to read one work about Darwin, you should read their work, and yet it is so controversial and maybe so wrong. In Britain, this was what the front cover of the book looked like, simply titled Darwin, nothing else. But behold the American edition, complete with a subtitle, Darwin, The Life of a Tormented Evolutionist. Now, about the last thing you get from Darwin's memoir is the sense that he was in any way, shape or form tormented. But this was Desmond Moore's Darwin, a man who was torn apart by his discovery of evolution through natural selection, who was so concerned about its potential effects on society and on religion that he kept it to himself for nearly 20 years. They dwell at considerable length upon the torment of Darwin as he thinks about whether he should or should not go public with his radical idea. So much does he torment himself that he makes himself ill. For them, his illness is psychosomatic. Like many other of Darwin's recent biographers, Desmond and Moore were at pains to demonstrate how his ideas had emerged out of the times in which he lived, how social forces had propelled his ideas. Now, they may be regarded as a particularly extreme version of that, but even someone who is more staid is probably an unfair word for Janet Brown. Janet Brown, who has really written the definitive biography of Darwin. But she's certainly more sober, that's a better word. She's a more sober writer. But even Brown is looking for those forces that shape Darwin the man and the ideas that come from Darwin the man. More recently, Janet Brown has suggested that maybe we should approach the biography of Darwin from a different angle. Maybe we should try and write a meta-biography of Darwin. Well, what do we mean by the phrase meta-biography? In essence, it is a biography of biographies. What it seeks to do is demonstrate that all biography, like all history, is the product of its times, and we learn as much about the times in which a biography was written as we learn about the subject of that biography. Indeed, metabiography allows us to see how someone was judged how someone was regarded or thought of during particular eras. In fact, we can begin to use it to see the way that Darwin was regarded through history and the way his ideas were thought about at those particular points in time. Maybe it's absurd to even think that we could somehow uncover the real Darwin, in which case metabiography becomes an important tool for understanding Darwinism. And on that note, we will end the lecture.